Hello and welcome to Network Insights from Move Consulting. For those new to the series, this is our opportunity to speak to the amazing people who make up our network and for them to share insights into their work in supporting people to be more physically active. In this, the 14th episode in the series, we're going to focus our conversations on supporting people living with dementia to be more physically active. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Elaine to introduce today's guest.
Hello everyone, it's great to be back again on our 14th episode at the moment. And it's great to have with us Jenna Peel, who leads on the physical activity work for Alzheimer's. Excuse me, I'm losing it. And so I will let Jenna tell us a little bit about her role, and also, I know that you've had years of experience working around the whole area of physical activity and long-term conditions. So could you tell us a little bit about your background as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm Jenna. I'm the Physical Activity Policy Manager at Alzheimer Society. I've been in my role for the past year, which has gone very, very quickly. It's all going well. Prior to that, I've been in the charity sector for feels like forever. But yeah, since I think 2014. About 8 years. So I started off working at Macmillan Cancer Support in the physical activity team there, in sort of project officer and intervention development roles. And then I moved over to the British Lung Foundation, now known as Asthma and Lung UK, and I was their physical activity lead there for about 4 years. And then I moved over to Alzheimer's last year. So yeah, been working in long-term conditions and physical activity for sort of the main chunk of my career, and yeah, something I feel really passionately about, supporting people to live as fulfilled lives as possible, and physical activity being a way to achieve that, I suppose. So yeah.
Oh, that's great, because you've had that that experience across a number of conditions, but obviously specifically you're looking at dementia now. And I think we're hearing more and more and more about the evidence around the role that physical activity can have in the prevention and management of dementia. And so I'd just like to hear more about some of those benefits that we're aware of and the evidence is telling us now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really strong evidence for the prevention, or the role of physical activity in the prevention of dementia. At Alzheimer's Society, we focus largely on people already with a diagnosis. So our physical activity work is focusing on supporting, managing the lives of people who are living with dementia and what role physical activity can play there. The evidence is really interesting. We've been working on physical activity for a while at the Society, so the work has been going on for longer than I've been around. It's been happening since 2018, so we've been partnering with Sport England since then, and we're still working in partnership with them, and our work has always been funded by them in the National Lottery. And we've entered a new phase of that partnership last year, and we actually kicked that off with an evidence review, because it wasn't something that we'd formally completed as a charity so far. And as you say, there's lots of evidence out there, but it hadn't been sort of brought together in a meaningful way for us as a charity, at least. So we commissioned an external evidence review last year, which was completed by Brunel University, and it was really, really interesting. We actually haven't published it any more widely yet, but we will be looking to do that in time. But we've just got loads going on, but we will be looking to disseminate that further. But yeah, the evidence was really interesting. So the review looked at a couple of areas. I suppose I know you've asked particularly about benefits, but I thought it just worth mentioning as well that the review also looked at the prevalence of physical inactivity in people living with dementia. So we know that people living with long-term conditions are twice as likely to be inactive compared to someone without, but we didn't have any. That's data from the Richmond group, who we work really closely with as well, but we didn't have any specific insight into what activity looked like for people living with dementia. And the review basically told us that the evidence is so limited, so there were only 2 studies that came back that actually had any insight into that. And whilst there were only 2 studies, they both suggested that people living with dementia are less active compared to comparable populations, so older adults and people living with other long-term conditions. So they have higher sedentary behaviour, so more time resting, and lower levels of physical activity. So I suppose that shows to us that it is an issue for people with long-term conditions in general, but particularly for our audience who don't have to be older. So dementia isn't actually something that is necessarily it's not a normal part of aging. It can affect younger people, but on the whole, it is that the population of people with dementia are older. But yeah, that was really interesting to see that actually, yes, that our population are more likely to be inactive, and shows that we've got a big pool of people who could benefit from the support of becoming more physically active. But as well as looking at prevalence, we looked at like the benefits and the experiences of people living with dementia in terms of physical activity. And again, the data was quite limited. So we focused the review on large randomized control trials just to look at the sort of highest strength of evidence. And what we found is that the majority of those large randomized control trials focused on high intensity, instructor-led, structured exercise. So your very typical like cycle on a stationary bike for 45 minutes 3 times a week, or similar type programs to that. And the research actually showed us that these very high intensity or moderate to high intensity structured programs, that actually there weren't many benefits for people living with dementia specifically, which we found very interesting. There were benefits evident for certain outcomes like balance and overall physical activity levels. But on the whole, for the majority of the outcomes, the results weren't necessarily positive. So things like quality of life, cognitive activity, the exercise groups weren't actually showing improvements in those areas, which at first we thought, oh, okay, that's very interesting. Why is that happening? We're not quite sure. We actually spoke to some of the authors of the papers to try to understand that a little bit more. And it comes back to that, it being that very high intensity structure type exercise, which just doesn't seem to necessarily have a beneficial effect for people living with dementia. But what the review did tell us when we looked at the more qualitative evidence, which considered physical activity in a broader sense, so not just that high intensity structured program or rehabilitation type exercise, it considered it more in a broad sense, like walking, dementia friendly community group, and more general physical activity. And this is where we saw reports of people living with dementia benefiting, particularly in terms of their well-being. So these types of perhaps more accessible activities that people have chosen to do, or ones that were a continuation of things that they used to do when they were younger, like a continuation of life course activities. That was where we saw really strong reports to say that physical activity was associated with well-being, which is really encouraging for us, I think, particularly because as a charity we want to be able to support that personalised support, and this review enabled us to say, yeah, that's exactly why we shouldn't be prescribing one size fits all approach, which I think we all know in terms of long-term conditions, everyone is so different from one person to the next, even if they've got the same condition. Yeah, we need to consider the needs of that person, what they want to do, what they enjoy. So that was sort of the main thing that came out of our review, like considering the promotion of that personalised physical activity, understanding the person, so that we can make sure that they can get those well-being benefits, I suppose.
So Jenna, can you tell us a little bit about where that work that you're doing is going now? What other things have you got happening?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, we've sort of moved away from the very focused work that just looked at the sport and physical activity sector, and we sort of entered the next phase of our partnership with Sport England last January. So this phase of the partnership has been focusing on like gathering research and insight. So we've completed our evidence review, and we've been completing some insight gathering in-house. So we've done some desk-based research into barriers and motivators, and we've been doing lots of focus groups and interviews with people living with dementia and professionals as well. And then we're currently working with our innovation team. So we are doing what they describe as sprints. So we're doing 2 sprints, which are basically like a fast-paced way of working to develop solutions to real-world problems. So the problem being that people living with dementia aren't as physically active to support their health as perhaps they could be, because as the prevalence data suggests. So we are currently working on our first sprint. We're coming to the point at which we've developed the solution. So we've worked really closely with people living with dementia, carers, professionals, to gather loads of insight and try to turn that into a workable solution that would, will hopefully work in the real world. So what we've developed, like, it brought up loads of different insight, but the main things that sort of came up were that people didn't necessarily know what physical activity is, so they often associate it with sport and exercise, which probably isn't a surprise to us. But they also, some barriers were people's motivation and their level of social support. More related to dementia, we also saw that the cognitive impact of having dementia caused a barrier to people as well. And then we saw things that we've already talked a little bit about, that limited knowledge of why physical activity could be good for someone living with dementia, and that goes for both people with dementia and their carers, particularly knowing why it's important and why, that what benefits there are. So there was that, which was all sort of very important insights to address. And then the final one was around the role of health and social care professionals, and the timing of an intervention, because at the moment there is no sort of standard pathway for physical activity within dementia. There isn't for a lot of long-term conditions, the majority, but understanding what the role is there and how it could be embedded potentially. So those were all of our insights. We probably can't address them all at once, but the one thing that we have decided to produce as a result to try to address as many as possible is a motivational resource that people living with dementia can use at home with a carer or with a professional. It's called the Feel Good folder. So we're currently developing it at the moment. It's actually with the designer at present, so we're sort of going back and forth over the design of it, but it's very exciting. So the folder will essentially, it's focusing on feeling good, because we actually heard that there were negative associations even with the word physical activity. So we're trying to focus on the benefits that people will hopefully see if they are able to be supported to be more active. There's health information in there covering off benefits, how to get started, how to stay safe, those types of things. There is a behaviour change activity element to it. So there is what I suppose internally we're calling a workbook, but it won't be called that, so it's just part of the folder, but just activities that people can complete themselves or with the help of a family member or friend, or they might even complete it at a group. If they're at a dementia cafe or something, they might like to sit together and support each other to complete it. But there are questions around why the person wants to become more active, so they can start thinking about why it is that they'd like to, what they might feel like, how life might be different, sort of drawing on lots of those sort of motivational interviewing type techniques, and all sort of backed up by behaviour change techniques too. So those sorts of things, how they might get started, what activities they might like to try, some problem solving, so what could get in the way and what could you do about it, and then some ways of tracking their activity too. So we're including an activity diary in there as well, and a wall chart that people can use and put up visually in their home with stickers to make it nice and simple. And we've made the wall chart completely, like, it's just cumulative, so it's not time bound in any way. And we've had feedback that actually people living with long-term conditions, if they're given a visual aid around their physical activity, actually if it's time bound, there are periods of time where they inevitably will be inactive, because living with a long-term condition, everything fluctuates. So actually we've just kept it very simple and removed the time element, and it's simply just when you do something, record it if you enjoyed it. So we're trying to keep that nice and simple. And then the final element of the folder is something that we're calling the movement deck. It's essentially like a deck of cards which give activity inspiration, and that people can do out and about or in the home or with their friends and family, combined with some quotes from people living with dementia and some feel-good facts about how physical activity can benefit people and what it means to be physically active. So that is being developed at the moment, and we're testing it next month in 3 or 4 memory clinics across England. So we're looking to make sure it's distributed through health and social care professionals, because we know that came up as well as an issue, that people didn't know where to get information, but they would like it to come from a trusted source. So we're going to be testing that across a few different memory clinics, which is where someone generally receives a diagnosis and for their dementia. Testing that over the summer, and then looking at how we can scale that up beyond that point. So yeah, we're really excited. So there'll be a paper, a physical pack or folder, and then it will also link to resources online where we try to bring people together. Like there'll be a feel-good community within our Dementia Talking Point website, so where we try and get the conversation going a bit more around physical activity and what people are doing to move more. And there will also be a page for professionals. So we don't currently have like a space for lots of our professional facing information, like things like our evidence review. So we're looking to produce a page that is more for health and social care professionals, but I think it would also be relevant to decision makers, policy makers, and programme deliverers as well, and people working in the sport and physical activity industry, to find out more about the evidence, find out how they can use the resources that we're developing, like the folder, because it could be something that people working in the sport and physical activity sector would like to be able to give to people, so that they've got something at home that can help to motivate them too and support the delivery of sessions as well. So
I mean, as you know, I was involved with dementia friendly swimming, the development of that, and I found that whole area absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons. I mean, the big one for me, because I remember when I first came into post, going down to meet the Nottingham group, which is this lovely group of people who were at various stages of their dementia journey. So there were some that had joined because they wanted to understand the disease, and they were getting, I mean, that's what they did really well afterwards. There was always a chat, and there was always that support around that. So just understanding what was going to happen to them and how they would be able to manage that. So that was a big part of that. But there was also what I found really interesting for some of the carers were saying the change in the individual when they came out that pool was unbelievable, because getting somebody with dementia is quite a challenge into a pool, as you can imagine, because there's lots of things that they have to get through to get into the water, as it were. But what they were saying to us, and we were trying to understand it, and we've got obviously no evidence other than anecdotes, but they were saying there is something about being in the water for those individuals that had a profound impact on their mood for up to 2 days afterwards. And we had people saying like, oh, my husband comes out the water and it's like I've got him back again, because he's calm. And we were like, well, what is it? And one of the coordinators was saying, well, for a lot of people, swimming's associated with childhood holidays. And we think it's something about that memory of that's coming back and giving them that increase and uplift in mood. And you're like, wow, you know, it's just the way the brain works is unbelievable. It's just fascinating. So, and that muscle memory as well, which is very different from, you know, your memory, normal memory, but other memories. I think there's something about that muscle memory that it stays there and it's more ingrained. Even if we had people there, they would arrive and they couldn't remember if they could swim or they couldn't. And some, it turned out, couldn't, some couldn't. So we had to be very careful about getting them into the water. But once they were in there, it came back to them and they were like a fish, you know, off they went. So absolutely fascinating area. So
yeah, and that came up in our review as well, like activities that elicited those positive memories were associated with well-being too. And I think the other thing with perhaps dementia friendly swimming as well, and those other kind of group activities, that was something else that came out in the review, that positive or enhancements in well-being were also related to factors like having an element of social connection through the activity that they're doing. So you don't necessarily have to do a structured activity or go to a group or something in particular. It could just be dancing around your kitchen. But activities where you're able to connect with others, particularly as that's something that people living with dementia and their carers can often lose, because living with dementia is, well, I mean, I don't know because I don't have it, but it's just really, really difficult, and particularly difficult for carers. And those sort of more group activities or activities where people go along to something specific can also enable the carer to have some respite as well, which wasn't a focus of our review, but also quite an interesting insight, I suppose, to how there are multiple benefits, just not necessarily for the person involved, but also for their friends and family too.
Yeah, there was some there was a good few projects focused around reminiscence, particularly connection with sport as a form of physical activity, you know, and those benefits that we've been talking about, where it's taking them back to a previous episode in their life, or a period in their life where they can start to feel and sense more things that kind of bring them to life, like you were saying, Elaine. And I think in relation to carers, that's really, really important. It's an important part of that, if we call it ecosystem, that goes around the individual as well. And when we think of this in relation to when we're designing an intervention or a program, that there's the individual, but often, particularly when working with and targeting those living with long-term conditions, there's a support network that goes around that person as well. So when we're talking in relation to the behaviour change elements that we need to think about, if said carer can't bring an individual or can't be there with them to support them in the way they need, that can be a blocker to being active, can't it? I think it was Activity Alliance again who put out some research in relation to the activity levels of carers, and they are, in the same sense as you mentioned, twice as likely themselves to be as inactive as the person that they care for. From a purist physical activity perspective, dependent on the individual they're supporting, they may have quite an active occupation as a role, if you will, as a carer in manually supporting somebody and what have you. But generally speaking, if the individual living with that long-term condition is sedentary themselves, sat down watching Netflix or whatever it be through habit as much as physical capability, the carer is likely to be there doing it with them. Like you say, Jenna, the importance of that social element to it. The individual and their carer may be the only two people that they ever see of each other, because they're so well connected and working together. So really important in that sense. It also makes me think as well, it's the same for so many other long-term conditions. If we think back, Elaine, to the conversation we had with Anna Campbell, now that was about the specifics and the complexities of the different types of cancer and treatments for them. Back to that same message at the heart of it, whatever it is we do needs to be tailored to the individual.
And when you look at, I mean, we'll go on to talk about some tips and things to consider when you're setting up and devising and developing programs or initiatives or whatever for people who've got dementia. But I mean, that's where we went with the water wellbeing model, because we started off with dementia and we kind of went, if you get it right for somebody with dementia, you get it right for pretty much everybody else, because you have to think so specifically through some of the challenges that people with dementia face in terms of how they see the world and the environment, and the fact that, well, it's, I mean, we ended up devising a thing called a locker saddle, because I don't know about you, I go wandering into different changing rooms and they're all different and they've all got a different locker system, and I can't remember which number it is, and if it's not written on my armband, I have not got a hope in hell in remembering it. So so for people with dementia, that's like 10 times worse. So what we did was we created this little bit of plastic which had a a photo, a place to put a photo on the front of it that could go over the top of the locker, and you could put your keys in the back. So there's a little net. I've got one somewhere. I'll have to dig it out. And it made it easier for people to find their locker. And I was thinking, will I get away with using that for myself? Because I think I might be.
I can do with that. At times I've had to sort of forage around and try and find where my locker is. And also, like, not knowing what you need for the locker, like whether you need a coin or whether you need to remember a code or I mean, I can imagine for someone living with dementia or any kind of memory difficulties, it must just be very difficult, and then just provides an additional barrier. So it's really nice to hear about that solution. Sounds like it could benefit everyone, as you say.
If you've listened to any of the previous episodes, Elaine's got a thing about lockers. She tries to bring it into pretty much every conversation.
Strange fetish, isn't it?
Started on lockers. No, it is. We mentioned one of the key things that we'd want to try and achieve out of every conversation are some of those hints and tips that people can take away. So let's focus our kind of conversation there. We've already shared loads from what I've been listening into. You've shared tons within what you've said already, Jenna, but are there any kind of real key fundamental big blocks when we're thinking about, I've got this program idea, or I've got something that's already running and I would like to make it, if we use the phrase more dementia friendly, what are the big things I need to be thinking about, would you say?
I'd say the first one, which Elaine has already said, but it's just around the tailoring, like making sure it's individualized. Like, understand your audience, your community, who are you supporting, and finding out from them what their needs are, how you can make it better for them, how you can reduce some of those barriers, and enable them to be more active. So that's probably core to any program design for any long-term condition, not just dementia, but
to step in there, that's a key thing there, where that bias comes in of, well, that's the same for everyone, so we undervalue the fact that that's there. That makes it even stronger. And like Elaine mentioned before, if you get it right for dementia, you get it right for everyone, I think was the phrase you used, Elaine. But on the grand scheme of things, that for me makes that even more important, that this will, because it's going to drive inclusion and it's going to drive the ability to make it become a kind of a common behavior, a common characteristic of what we get to know physical activity is like. So that's brilliant. Don't undervalue it.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And
next? What are we doing next?
Well, without complicating things, I think another phrase that we quite like to use in our team is, if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia, because it affects people so differently. So I suppose it would be keeping that in mind as well, and not making any assumptions. Some people with dementia won't necessarily have memory difficulties. It is one of the most common symptoms, but some people won't. They might have more behavioural symptoms, or more like visuospatial symptoms. So I suppose just not necessarily making any assumptions about what someone might need or want, or remembering some of those other perhaps lesser known symptoms that are available. So we do have Dementia Friends training as well, which is something that is available to access online. I think it can also be delivered face to face on more of a partnership level, but that's something else to say for organisations who are looking to support people specifically affected by dementia. Then that's a really good one to do. And also, if even if you're not, it's just good. I was on the website last week, and there are examples of people who've done the training and then been able to identify people in supermarkets who look a little bit like they might need some help. So just in everyday life, it's useful. So I'd recommend that. The other thing for program design and delivery is that we, in our first phase of the partnership with Sport England, we produced a dementia-friendly sport and physical activity guide, which my colleague Steve led on. So he would be the one to talk to you about that. It's not the focus of our work anymore, because that was very sector focused and looking at how we could support the sector to become more dementia friendly, specifically in terms of like staff, their awareness, their training, the programs being delivered. So are there any kind of adjustments or changes that need to be made to make them accessible to people living with dementia, but also the environment, so the physical place, are there things that you should avoid, particularly in the environment, to make it more inclusive for people living with dementia, make it easier. So the guide focuses on those 3 areas, so people, programme and place. So I'd say anyone working in the sport and physical activity sector, the guidance was produced, I think back in 2019, and then so it's a few years, but it's still very much like very relevant, provides lots of good sort of tools and guidance within there to support deliverers to make their programs and their facilities accessible to people living with dementia. And I think it's probably even more important now in our post-COVID, I don't know if we are post-COVID yet, it still feels like we're in it, out of it. But post-pandemic and post-lockdowns, I suppose, even more important to consider those things, just to make we know a lot of people are still worried about going out and about. So if you can make your facilities and your the classes that you're putting on, whatever, as accessible as possible, it should hopefully benefit everyone, not just people living with dementia. Yeah. So
I can totally recommend that guide. We help feed into some of the learning from Dementia Friendly Swimming into it, which was good, and that whole design of the environment again I found really interesting, because you mentioned that different types of dementia, and the one that I just had no awareness of but now obviously do was the concept of the black mat at the front door being for someone with dementia, that's a black hole, and it's very scary. And some of these wonderfully polished surfaces that you have on floors and things, that's water, that's what they're seeing. And so the whole how we design our buildings from the beginning is massive. But we found that there were, those are big things to try and change, but there were some just making small changes to the environment, like the signposting, making it easier to navigate a building, all of that can make a big difference for somebody. And so I think, it doesn't have to be big things. It can be those little things. And I would recommend that Dementia Friends training as well. Again, I found the whole experience really interesting, and it's helped me a lot with when I'm aware of relatives who have got dementia, just understanding that illness and understanding what they're going through. So definitely worth a good thing.
I have not living with dementia, but with a different long-term health condition. A friend put it in a brilliant way to me. So in terms of the environment, so there's the signage, the physical stuff that we need to be thinking about in terms of that, but then the environment is created by the people that are in it as well. So building your awareness of dementia and other long-term conditions, and essentially trying to understand the people that you might engage with as best you can, will help you feel comfortable as the person delivering or acting within a program in whatever guise. And yeah, a friend, I was kind of saying, what I do struggle with is, because I don't live with any long-term health condition, what does it genuinely feel like? Let me try to understand and empathize with you in your situation. And she said, I like to think of it like this. I'm a bit like a rock star celebrity. And when I walk in and tell people who I am, they suddenly get all nervous around me. And that's the way that she understands it. I'm a bit of a rock star and they get nervous and don't know what to say to me. So that's the way when I talk to my friends, and she was obviously saying it to me. So hi, Debbie, if you're watching. That's the way that she explained it. I was like, I get you now, because when I see somebody, I get a bit starstruck, and that those emotions, she's like, it's just like that. That's the only way that I can get it across to people. So, and it is that thing of, the importance of both the built environment and the environment that you create, the atmosphere, the whatever you call it. You can't really name it, can you? But that thing where you just click and you're in and you're feeling great. So I thought that was relevant to chuck into the conversation there. Feel free, if you're going to nick it, it's Debbie Colson.
Yeah, that's right. And people make such a big difference as well. So it's make the difference between someone wanting to go somewhere or not. And I think we were when we were talking about carers earlier as well, and the support network, some of the insight that we've done more recently, sort of following our evidence review, has shown some of the barriers in terms of carers getting their loved one somewhere, but also how some carers can be really supportive of like general physical activity, which is, I guess, more of our focus now, rather than looking at specifically just structured sport and exercise or physical activity, and looking at how some people have a support network in place that really facilitate physical activity and or make sure that they're, you know, getting involved in things around the house and going out for walks and doing whatever they would like to do. But we've also seen, on the other hand, that sometimes when people are diagnosed with a long-term condition, particularly dementia, it seems that it's like, oh no, you, and I suppose probably, I think we used to say that in with cancer as well, sort of like rest is best. I think that can be someone's mindset in terms of, oh, you just sit there and I'll do everything for you, and actually take away some of those opportunities to be active. So I suppose that would be like another thing to think about. Don't, just because they have dementia doesn't mean you need to treat them necessarily any differently, but just thinking about what can you do to still make them feel fulfilled, make them feel independent and like their old self. Because I think when someone does get a dementia diagnosis, so much is taken from them. And there's not often a lot that's given to them. There aren't many treatments available. So often people are given a diagnosis, and that's good. It's really important to have a diagnosis so you can make sure that you access the care that you need. But often there's not a lot that can necessarily be provided to you that can help you take control or to do something positive for yourself. So I'd say physical activity, I think it's really important that we understand that people living with dementia can benefit from that. And we know that the qualitative evidence from our evidence review and lots of anecdotal evidence as well, just from Elaine, as you were saying about the dementia friendly swimming. We've spoken to lots of people over the last year to find out more about their experiences, and heard how important physical activity can be for people. So yeah, it's just about remembering that, and remembering that it's sort of something that's part of, we want to make it part of people's everyday life as well. So something that becomes normal to think about when you've got dementia or any long-term condition, or just generally as people to think about as a sort of public health message, I suppose, too.
I think there's also an area that I'm really interested in is around the care sector, because obviously ultimately that's where a lot of people with dementia will end up in care sector and care homes. And Bob LaVenture, who used to be part of the team at the BHF National Centre, did some work developing a tool called Care About Physical Activity, which went into every single Scottish care home. And it was about, again, a whole systems approach to understanding how do you keep people in care homes more active, get them more active and get them moving. So it included things like letting the relatives of the person know this was happening, because sometimes there's such a fear in care homes about fit people falling or tripping or whatever else, and that can actually stop physical activity from happening. So there's lots of things around that, about how do you educate the relatives that these are there, how do you get the staff supportive to try and encourage and do that. And I know it's been a real challenge with COVID, with shortness of staff in care homes, and I think that is the real challenge, is how do we get that back? How do we, because that frailty is just only going to get worse if people are left sitting in their chairs all the time. So yeah, it's a good resource to have a look at. I think it's still available online that you can see it, so recommend having a look at it.
On the grand scheme of things, as Jenna, you mentioned just slightly before, what work we can do and what things can we put in place to really just support that social norm. So how can we make it that physical activity is seen as, because it is such a great and powerful tool for a whole range of, and even though the direct evidence necessarily isn't there to say that A leads to B, there's that much broader kind of benefit to our health and well-being, that whether we're living with a long-term condition or not, whether dementia or otherwise, it will help us all. If we can get it right for dementia, we'll get it right for other people. If physical activity is good for our general health and well-being, why does that change because we've been diagnosed with dementia? It doesn't, is the answer, I think, in reality. There is so much within this conversation. I can't wait to listen back to this one. We've just done a podcast for the review of last year's episodes of Network Insights, and one of the points I made was you're so tuned into the conversation at times that you don't pick up on everything that's been said. So it's brilliant to watch them back as well. And I'm looking forward to this one, Jenna. Thank you so much for sharing so many insights from the work that's going on at the Alzheimer Society. For the guides and the resources that you mentioned, we'll make sure to place links for those below this video. So please do check the feed below, or do a good old Google and check the Alzheimer Society, and you'll be able to navigate your way to find more information there and new information as it comes around. Thanks again for watching this episode of Network Insights. If you would like to learn more about other episodes in the series, you can head to the Move Consulting website. That's moveconsulting.co.uk/network-insights. But apart from that, we are at the end. So again, thank you very much, Jenna.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.
Right. See you later, everyone.